Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. In today's class, we will look at chapter 10 in your book, which is titled Changing Cultural Traditions. Focus on Europe from 14th to 17th century. So as the title of your chapter suggests, the focus of this chapter will be from the time period between 14th to 17th centuries, and the area of focus is Europe. So here in this chapter, we will look closely at the developments taking place in Europe between 14th to 17th centuries, that is roughly a period of 300 years. So in the 300 years, what all are the important developments and changes taking place in Europe? First, we'll see what are the causes of this change or the factors leading to the developments. And then secondly, we will look at what these developments are. And then thirdly, we will see the consequences of these developments, what these developments led to, and as a result, what kind of changes happened in Europe because of all these, and why it is important to know this, and in which ways it gets reflected in a later time and also in the present times in which we live in. So let's start the journey by starting or looking closely at the change or this period between 14th to 17th century in Europe. So first we'll have the introduction, where we see that the period from 14th to 17th century marked the transition of medieval Europe to modern times. So most important development of this period between 14th to 17th century is it marked the transition. So this word transition is very important because in this period a change or a shift is happening in Europe. And the most important shift or transition is from medieval to modern times. So from a medieval culture, Europe has a shift towards a modern period or a modern cultural, modern culture. So this becomes an important development in this period, that is transition from a medieval culture to a modern cultural period. And in the medieval times, people were guided by the idea of otherworldliness. So here the characteristic feature of the medieval period and of the medieval people is they were more concerned about the world after their death or what happened to them after death than the world in which they lived in or the earthly life. So the focus was on preparing themselves for the next life. So instead of giving importance to this life on earth, what people was concerned was the life after death or the next life. And the Christian church taught that life on earth was of secondary importance. Along with this, we know the church played a major role as one of the three orders of the feudal society. And the church also gave importance to this belief that the life after death is important, and so the responsibility of each human being is to prepare themselves to the next life. And the ideal man during this age was the cloistered monk who spent all his life praying and meditating and gave little thought to bodily comforts and beauties of this world. So the ideal man, That is, what ideal meant was how a person was supposed to be, or an ideal man was somebody whom others were supposed to imitate or to learn from. So the ideal man in the medieval period was a monk who spent all his time praying and meditating and preparing himself for the next life. Now we see how this transition to modern times came. So we already saw that it is a period of transition from from medieval to modern. And the question is, how did this transition happen? So during the period of from 14th to 17th century, that is about 300 years, the medieval pattern was revolutionized. So revolution, as we know, is a rapid and drastic change. So it is opposite. So it is different or opposite to what evolution is. So evolution is when changes happen at a slow pace, and revolution is when changes happen at a rapid phase or in a very drastic way. When change occurs, we call it revolution. Now the city life became more important than agriculture and manorial society. So one of the most important change is emergence of cities. So this happens at a very drastic way, that cities emerge as important centers during the period between 14th and 17th century, replacing agriculture and manorial estates. So the feudal system, which was rooted or based on manorial estates and dependence on serfs, gets affected by this new change happening, that is emergence of cities. And the second development is a few powerful national government emerged which took the place of little independent chiefs that had made up the feudal system. So we already saw the rise of absolute kings with a standing army for themselves. That is a national army and a national government which did not share power with sublords or other feudal lords, but had the ultimate authority and absolute power. So this is also another important development happening in this period. And Europe also broke the narrow geographical bonds that had kept it in ignorance to the rest of the world. So now Europe opened its borders. So opening the borders and trying to have trade relations with different parts of the world becomes an important shift in the period that marks the beginning of a modern era. And many adventurers and explorers discovered new continents and new trade routes. So this discovery of new trade routes and also new continents happen in this period. So this is also very important development which leads to this transition to modern times. And lately, in a period of 300 years of change, the whole tone of life in Europe was altered. So as a result of all these changes, the life in Europe itself got altered or changed in a revolutionary way. And men became anxious to discover new scientific truths and to make new inventions. So all this encouraged people to discover new scientific truths and new inventions. So from the 14th to the end of 17th century, towns were growing in many countries of Europe. See, we already saw the emergence of towns and cities. A distinct urban culture was developed. So this urban meant city, and because of the emergence of towns and cities, we see a new culture which is termed urban culture developing in Europe. And townspeople began to think of themselves as more civilized than rural people. So now people who got settled in towns and got involved in trade activities regarded themselves as more civilized than the people who lived in the rural area or in the village areas. So now we see there is rural, that is village, versus urban, that is cities. So rural meant village areas and urban referred to the cities and towns. And the townsmen or the people who lived in towns considered themselves to be more civilized and advanced than people who lived in the villages. And towns, particularly Florence, Venice, and Rome, became centers of art and learning. So these are the new towns which are emerging by the 14th century, and all these towns are there in the state of Italy, which emerged as an important center of learning and art during the 14th century. So the invention of printing press at the same time made available books to a large number of people, and a sense of history also developed in Europe. So invention of printing press becomes an important development which takes place in this period, and this helps people to have a more developed sense of one's own history, because by this time, with the coming of the printing press, more books are getting printed in this time, which helps people know better about their history, because now when the printing press comes into being, the publications, yes, so with the invention of printing press, there is a renewed sense of one's own history among people, because large number of books are getting printed, published, and circulated among people in this period. And the people now contrasted the modern world with the ancient Greek and Roman times. So as a result of this new sense of history developing in Europe, what we see is people start contrasting or comparing. So this comparison between their lives or their times with the olden times, that is ancient Greek civilization and the Roman period. So we already know in the history of Europe, the Greek civilization and its development, because this was a period which was considered to be a period of great enlightenment, of great philosophers, and a lot of rich philosophical books and other theoretical works are written in this period, in the ancient times. So this period for Europe was very important, and the Europeans took pride in having a great civilization to its credit. And the Roman Empire also, we have seen, was a great empire with a large territory, and this was a major development happening in Europe, that people started contrasting or comparing their times with the ancient times, like the Greek civilization and the Roman Empire. And all these changes which transformed the medieval into modern world are a part of great transitional movement which is known as Renaissance. So all these changes which are taking place and this transformation comes to be termed as Renaissance. And the Renaissance movement brought about a rediscovery of the individual. So this transition from medieval to modern is called Renaissance, and the rediscovery of the individual becomes the important element of this Renaissance. Now we see what is meant by the term Renaissance. So Renaissance is a French word which literally means new birth or revival. So the literal meaning of this word is new birth or revival. From the 19th century, historians use the term Renaissance to describe the cultural changes of the period between 14th and 16th century. So it is from 19th century onwards that historians or scholars use the term Renaissance to describe the cultural changes of the period between 14th and roughly 17th century. So the people who lived in Europe between 14th and 17th century do not call themselves or do not call that time period a period of Renaissance, but it's only later that when historians look at this period and study the importance of this period that they use the term Renaissance, which literally meant revival or rebirth, to name this period as a period of Renaissance. And it began especially in Italy. So the beginning of the Renaissance can be traced back to Italy when art, literature, and the ideas of ancient Greece were rediscovered and widely studied, causing a rebirth of activity in all these spheres. So beginning from Italy, and art, literature, and ideas of ancient Greece were rediscovered and widely studied, causing a rebirth of activity in all these spheres. So it is called, literally meant rebirth, because in this period, the old literature, art, which flourished in civilizations like ancient Greek and Rome, are revisited by scholars. The renaissance of the classical learning implies that the transitional movement of Europe marked the change from medieval to modern times. And it was marked by humanistic revival of classical influence expressed in the flowering of arts and literature and by the beginning of modern science. So as we already said, Renaissance means rebirth or revival. And what is getting reborn? The ancient classical traditions and cultures which the European people had forgotten for a long time. That is the antiquity or the ancient classical traditions, their writings, the philosophies, and theoretical understandings which had flourished in ancient Greek and Rome is now getting revisited, and that is why it is termed as a rebirth or revival of the old or the ancient. This culture was characterized by a new belief that man as an individual was capable of making his own decisions and developing his skills. So the major belief which makes this happen is that man as an individual is capable of making his own decision. So now, instead of relying on an almighty God who gives the man directions to do what is right and what is needed, we now have a shift or a change in belief where man comes to the center and he is considered to be capable of taking meaningful decisions and developing his own skills. And this man is modern in contrast to medieval man whose thinking had been controlled by the church. So this man, which stands for humanity or human beings, although this man is considered as somebody who is representing a male figure or a masculine figure, in this context, man stands for all of humanity. So that's why it is a synonym for the term human beings. So here, this human being or this man who emerges in this period of transition is a modern man who is different from the man who lived in the medieval times, because this medieval man was controlled by the church. The church had the authority over the man, and the church told him what is to be done and what is not to be done. He couldn't believe in his own skills and take decisions by his own. And it is therefore aptly called the age of discovery of the world and the man. So that's why we call it the discovery of man and the world. Because till this time, man is controlled by the church, and more than thinking about the world which he now lives in, he was concerned about the other world. So at this period, by the 14th century, we see that man comes to the center and the world which he lives in gets rediscovered. Now he gives importance to the world which he is right now in than the life he will be after death. Now we look at the causes of Renaissance and the factors responsible for its rapid progress. And it also consists of the contribution of West Asia. What kind of contribution West Asia is making to Europe, which helps in the spread of Renaissance at a very rapid way. So many of the causes of Renaissance lay in the developments in the period earlier than 14th century. So although it begins from the 14th century to the 17th century, obviously the factors responsible can be traced back to a period before 14th century. So the contacts of the Europeans with Muslims and Byzantine civilization was one of the factors. So the European countries had active contacts with the Muslims and the Byzantine civilization, that is the Eastern Roman Empire is termed the Byzantine civilization, and the Muslim traders was an important factor which became a cause of the spread of Renaissance. And the commercial revolution with its interchange of goods and ideas. So in this period prior to the 14th century, we also see a commercial revolution with active trade happening, and interchange of goods and ideas also became one of the cause of Renaissance. And the new learning of the 13th century created the spirit of enquiry among people. So by 13th century, there is a spirit of enquiry, that is to question things, that is to be critical of their times, emerges among people. That is also an important development which can be called a cause of Renaissance. And the rise of national monarchies. This is something which we have already seen, that absolute kings and the national army all are emerging in this time, which also happened to be one of the causes of Renaissance. And the growth of a wealthy, leisured middle class seeking prestige as patrons of art. So along with the emergence of cities, we see the townspeople emerging, and the merchants and traders who emerge alongside the active trade relations happening are now becoming the middle class or the bourgeoisie, who then play a major role in encouraging or funding art and other cultural things in Europe during the 14th to 17th century. So this emergence of the middle class also is one of the causes which leads to the Renaissance. The medieval age predicted the coming of Renaissance. So with all these developments in the medieval age itself, there was a prediction, or there was a thinking that this modern age will come soon. And all along the 14th century, there was constant appearance of the eager desire, which plainly indicated the coming change of revolution in the intellectual world. And by 14th century, this change becomes all the more striking and visible. The forerunners of the new spirit had attacked the abuses of the society and thus created public opinion against medievalism. So the forerunners is the predecessors of the modern times, who lived in the medieval times, but then who were actively observing the changes happening, had already predicted that it is now time for change. It is now time for man to rediscover himself and the world which he lives in, and to come out of the old medieval thinking. The era of discoveries and inventions, which began before the Renaissance movement, also paved the way for the movement. So the inventions and discoveries had started much before the 14th century. So this also plays a major role as a cause of Renaissance and its spread. The invention of printing press is something which we have already seen. It is important because it facilitated the spread of Renaissance by giving valuable books at cheap rates. So because of the printing press coming into being, there are more number of publications, more books are getting printed, and as a result, people are now getting very significant and helpful books at a very cheap rate, which earlier was not possible because there were only handwritten books, and it was difficult for people to get hold of those handwritten books, which were the circulation of which was very less because of very less availability of those books. But when the printing press came into being, this scenario changed, and now everybody had access to books, and those were available to them in cheap rates. The discovery of mariner compass encouraged maritime activities and consequently widened the outlook of the people of Europe. So the mariner compass is another important invention taking place, which helps in expanding trade routes and discovering new continents. The invention of the gunpowder made the kings powerful and independent of feudal nobility, and thus paved the way for new spirit in the political thought. So another important discovery or invention is the gunpowder, which made kings powerful and independent of feudal nobility. So now the kings could have a national standing army, and they were not dependent more on the other feudal lords for military purpose. And it paved the way for new spirit in the political thought. So the whole political structure and the administrative structure also went through a revolutionary change with the invention of gunpowder. So the capture of Constantinople by Turks in 1453 gave great impetus to the Renaissance movement. So another important development along with the discoveries is the capture of Constantinople, that is in Istanbul in Turkey today. It was captured by Turks by 1453 from the Roman Empire, and that becomes a great impetus or a cause of the Renaissance movement. The triumphs of Turks drove the learned Greeks to seek new homes in Italy. The change is this, that the triumph or the victory of the Turks, that is the Turkish Empire, drove the learned Greeks to seek new homes in Italy. What happens is, those Greeks who had lived in Constantinople before 1453 comes to Italy, because once those the Turkish areas are captured by the Turks, it becomes difficult for the Greeks to stay over there, and they shift their base to Italy and other European countries. And they brought their precious manuscripts with them. So this Greek people who had precious manuscripts, that is written materials or written books and other materials on great Greek civilization and the discoveries in that time, brought those manuscripts with them to Europe. And this caused the revival of interest in old Greek texts and in ancient law and philosophy. So as a result, the people in Europe started having great curiosity to know more about the great Greek civilization, which had important knowledge about ancient law and philosophy of those times. So these are certain causes which are then leading to Renaissance and its spread in all over Europe. So now we will look at some questions in regard to the topics which we have discussed till now. So the first question is, describe the way of life of the people during medieval age in Europe. So we know the transition happens to modern period in time between 14th to 17th century. And what is striking is, in the medieval period, people were guided by the idea of otherworldliness. This is very important. It means that their main concern was to prepare themselves for the next life. And the Christian church taught that life on earth was of secondary importance. So this is the way of life. They are controlled by the church. An individual is not having the choice of living the life according to his wishes, but it was church who decided on his behalf, and he was taught that what is important is the second life, that is after death, and not the life on this earth. And the ideal man was considered to be the monk who lived in the monastery, spending his life praying and meditating. So the prayer and meditations were considered most important and ideal way of living than discovering the world in which he was living in. And the second question is, what are the causes of the growth of Renaissance movement? So this is something which we have already seen. So before 14th century itself, the developments which lead to the transition begins. So these are contacts of Europeans with Muslims and Byzantine civilization, which help them get exposed or explore the world in a much better way. And the commercial revolution with its interchange of goods and ideas. So the commercial revolution and active trade relations with other parts of the world not only helped in interchange of goods, but ideas and other developments were also getting interchanged between these different geographical areas. The new learning of 13th century that created spirit of enquiry among the people. So by 13th century, there is a pattern of new learning emerging, which help people encourage or have the spirit of enquiry and questioning mind or a critical mind. And the rise of national monarchies with a standing army was very important, which led to the decline of the feudal structure and the rise of absolute kings. And the growth of a wealthy, leisured middle class seeking prestige as patrons of art. So the middle class was now emerging as a new order with the emergence of cities, and in order to show their power and establish themselves, they were giving a lot of importance to fund or give donations to artists and other people who were involved in art and other learning. So this also became one of the causes of the spread of Renaissance in the 14th to 17th century. So the other question is, give the name of 4 Italian cities which were the centers of new learning. So we already saw the Renaissance begins in Italy, and the reasons for it is also what we have looked at. So Italy, in the nation state of Italy, we see that learning centers like Genova, Venice, Milan, and Florence. These are certain cities which emerge or come up in Italy during the time of Renaissance as places of learning. And describe one important effect of printing press. We already saw that the discovery of printing press helps in circulation of books in large numbers among masses. This becomes very important. Till then, it was very difficult for people to procure or get hold of a book because it was all handwritten and very few copies of those books were available. Now, a large number of copies of the same books was available because of the printing press coming into being. And as a result, when more copies were available, the price of the books also went down and it became cheap. And when it became cheap, it was now easy for people to buy those books and get access to it and read it and improve their knowledge. So most of these books had information about the ancient Greek and ancient Roman civilization and the developments, which as a result gave people a new sense of one's own history. So this new sense of history emerges and they now see where they have come from, what importance the Greek and the Roman civilizations had, and how it is important to be critical of one's own world, and how it is important to rediscover themselves. So this is what leads to a, a kind of revival or rediscovery of man and the world. And when was Constantinople occupied by Turks? So it is in the year 1453 AD that the Turks captured Constantinople. So now we come to the revival of the Italian cities. We have already seen the 4 major cities which had become important place of learning during the period of Renaissance. And we see the chief cities of Italy was Florence, Genoa, Venice, and it became centers of Renaissance. And these cities were no longer parts of a powerful empire but were independent city-states. So important characteristic feature of the cities is it is not part of a powerful empire because the Roman Empire has already declined and now these cities are somewhat independent city-states. And they were different from other parts of Europe. The clergy were not politically powerful, nor were the feudal lords. Another important characteristic feature of these cities is it is different from other parts of Europe because the clergy or the church or the priests are not that powerful, and the feudal lords are also not controlling the other affairs. They are also not that strong or powerful in this period. And the rich merchants and bankers actively participated in the government. So the middle class or the bourgeoisie who emerged as townspeople were the active participants in the government. So other than the feudal structure where the Catholic Church and the nobility plays an important role, in these Italian cities, the important section was rich merchants and bankers who can be called the middle class. Now we look at new ideas and trends in literature and arts. So you have already seen there is a revival or rebirth of art and literature. So what are the new ideas and trends emerging here now? So the Renaissance movement consisted of 2 distinct yet closely related phases, namely the revival of classical literature and learning. Classical here refers to the ancient literature or the ancient times, which was the time period before medieval, and the revival of classical arts. So 2 things are happening in the period of Renaissance, that is revival of classical literature and the revival of ancient or classical arts. The literary and intellectual aspects of Renaissance movement are called humanism, and the promoters are known as humanists because of their interest in the studies of classics or the human letters in opposition to the divine letters, that is theology. So this is an important point, that the literary and intellectual aspects, that is revival of classical literature and learning, is called humanism. Humanism or humanism was promoted by people who were called the humanists because of their interest in studies of classics or human letters, which were different from the divine or the theological letters. That is, theology means study of God and whatever is related to the divinity or God. So till the medieval period, that is till the 13th century, more or less, people are writing, thinking, and making efforts to know more about the plans of God for human beings, what God intends to do for the humans, and how then human beings should respond to the plans of God. So that was termed theology, the study of God and the godly things or the divine things. But here, by the 14th century, there is a shift to taking interest in study of classical literature, that is the old literature of the ancient times. And the people who took interest in this study was called humanists, and this movement was called humanism. That is the interest in the literary and intellectual aspects of the classical time. So this humanism as a movement is very important because it deals with the literary and intellectual aspects. Now we look closely at this term humanism and how it develops. So the earliest universities in Europe had been set up in Italian towns. So we already saw it is Italy out of all the places in Europe that emerges as a center of Renaissance in the first place. It is then from Italy that it gets spread to other parts of Europe. So this educational program implied that there was much to be learned which religious teaching alone could not give. See, this is a very important point, that for the first time there is the realization that the education should not be confined to the teachings of religion. Instead, there are many other things which the religious teachings are incapable of dealing with. So it is important that an education should be of such sort which will give importance to aspects other than religious things. And this was the culture which historians in the 19th century were to label humanism. So similar to the term Renaissance, the term humanism also emerges at a later period because the historians who then look back into the medieval period and look at this transition movement, they term this phenomenon of taking interest in intellectual and literary aspects of classical period as humanism. And by the early 15th century, the term humanist, so by the early 15th century, the term humanist was used for masters who taught grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. So those people who taught these subjects, which were related to to literature and literary works, were called the humanist. The Latin word humanitas, from which humanities was derived, had been used many centuries ago by the Roman lawyer and essayist Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BC, a contemporary of Julius Caesar, to mean culture. So this is a long sentence, but it is very important too, because now we talk about the origin and the meaning of the term humanist or humanism. Where is this word coming from and what it meant? So this word is the Latin word humanitas, and it is from this word humanitas that the term humanities gets derived. And this term humanities was not used for the first time in the 14th century, but long before that, in the classical period, this Roman lawyer who is termed Cicero, whose name was Cicero, had used this word in his writing. And he was the contemporary, or he lived during the time of Julius Caesar, the emperor of great Roman Empire. And the meaning of this term, humanities, was culture. So in short, we can say that humanities, which comes from the Latin term humanitas, meant culture. So the study of humanities is study of human culture. And these subjects were not drawn from or connected with religion and emphasized skills developed by individuals through discussion and debate. So here, instead of giving importance to religious aspects, the importance was given to the skills developed by individuals or human beings through discussion and debate.